Well, it's good to be with you today. As Stephen mentioned, my topic is Europe, a continent in economic and cultural crisis. I think since late 2007, we've all known that America's economy has been struggling mightily to overcome what many people today call the Great Recession. But across the Atlantic, many European nations, but especially including Western European nations, and even more especially Southern Mediterranean European nations, have been experiencing their worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. So whether it's heavy debt, high unemployment, declining productivity, unaffordable welfare states, or simply a very unstable currency, all these problems suggest that Europe is in very deep, long-term economic trouble. Now, to put this in perspective, we should remember that in 1900, Europe literally ruled most of the world. Today, however, Europe is at risk at becoming what some people call the sick man of the global economy. Now, of course, there are some directly economic causes of Europe's economic problems. But while economics explains some things, there are many things that economics does not explain, including, I have to add, about the economy. Because at a deeper level, I don't think it's economics that moves history. Rather, I think it's culture and the ideas and values that characterize a given culture, for better and sometimes for worse. So in our short time this afternoon, I want to do three things. First of all, I'm going to outline the primary economic features of Europe's crisis. Second, I want to identify some of the cultural factors that I believe are central to Europe's current economic problems. The third thing I want to do is talk a little bit about how Christians and the church might help to address some of these deeper issues. But before I begin, let me make two caveats. First of all, as we all know, there are in fact many Europes. Britain is not France, France is not Poland, Poland is not Finland, and I have to say, in my experience, nowhere is like Greece. My point is simply this, that any discussion of Europe inevitably involves a certain degree of generalization. My second caveat is that nothing I say today about Europe is meant to imply that other countries, such as China or America, are somehow doing everything right. In my view, America and China are making at present some major economic errors, and of course, as we know, they face their own cultural challenges. However, I do think there are two reasons why all of us need to be worried about Europe. First of all, the rest of the world cannot be protected from Europe's economic problems. If, for instance, the euro just simply ceases to exist, which is a real possibility, then it will have consequences for the entire global economy. Second, and perhaps most importantly, I believe that Europe's present problems can teach us many things. Because the more we understand Europe's difficulties, especially the connection between its economic problems and what I'm going to describe as its cultural challenges, the more I think we will be better equipped to address similar problems as they emerge in America. Now, certainly many of the economic issues about which I'm going to talk today are quite specific to Europe, and even more specifically to Western Europe and Southern Europe. But the cultural factors shaping many of the economic changes that are going through Europe right now, these cultural changes are also manifesting themselves in the United States right now. Welfare dependency, for example, is no longer just a European problem. It now confronts America as well. So let's begin by me identifying what I think are Europe's primary economic difficulties. In my view, there are 6 main difficulties. Now, for most people, the first and most visible sign of Europe's economic problems is debt. Debt, especially government debt, is Europe's #1 conversation topic when it comes to economics today. Now, in itself, I think we all know that debt in itself is not always a problem. Debt, for example, is the normal way that most people acquire the capital that they need to start a business, for example. But heavy debt has become a way of life for many European citizens and most European governments. In 2010, for example, so 2 years ago, German government debt amounted to 85% of gross domestic product. France's was also 85%. Italy's was 120%. Belgium's was 100%. And Greece's was 150%. Today it's about 160%. Now, these figures are disturbing. But even more worrying, I think, is the future. It's been estimated, for example, that if European governments do nothing to address their debt problems, then within 20 years, German government debt will have risen to 400% of GDP, Italian government debt to 250%, French government debt to 400%, and Spanish government debt to 550%. Now just think about those numbers. 400%, 250%, 400%, 550%. I think such numbers are almost beyond our comprehension. But you may ask, well, what's the problem with heavy government debt? Well, in economic terms, it matters because there's increasing evidence that high government debt results in declining economic growth. In other words, high government debt slowly cripples an economy's capacity to produce wealth in a consistent manner over the long term. And that, of course, brings us to the question of how did so many European governments become so highly indebted? Well, here we come to the second feature of Europe's economic crisis. It's called the euro. Now, there have been some benefits from the euro. The euro, for example, has made it much easier to trade across European boundaries. But the euro's current problems result from having a single currency while allowing individual nations to pursue their own spending policies. Let me explain. In very simple terms, governments of countries such as Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, they knew that preserving the euro meant that if any of them engaged in excessive spending, other euro members had to rescue them. Otherwise, the entire euro project would collapse. Now, today we know that governments like Greece and Portugal cynically calculated that they could borrow and spend, because maintaining the euro's credibility would force more responsible euro members, such as Germany, to save nations like Greece from bankruptcy. And they were right, because preservation of the euro is the main reason today why Germany is almost single-handedly trying to save the economies of Southern Europe. Now, the question we have to ask, however, is what have governments in Europe been spending all this debt on? Well, that leads us to the third feature of Europe's economic problems. It's called the welfare state. Now, I suspect that many of you know that the modern welfare state began in 19th century Germany. After 1945, however, the state's delivery of welfare services accelerated across the Western Europe. Governments of both the right and the left sought to promote things like generous unemployment benefits, free access to healthcare, sound familiar? And old age and disability pensions to increasing numbers of people. Now, this all seems very reasonable, even humane. But there's one unpleasant reality about welfare states that's now confronting Europe, and it's this. Welfare states are very, very expensive. They tend to grow, and the growth is very hard to stop. In 1960, for example, total government spending in Western Europe averaged 29% of GDP. By 1970, this figure had risen to 37%. In 1980, the figure reached 47%. Today, government spending in most Western European countries averages 50% of GDP. That's half the economy. And most of this is spent on welfare. So, why has welfare spending increased? Well, one reason is that Europeans are living longer. That increases, naturally, healthcare and pension costs. Another reason is that Europeans are retiring early. Less than 20% of people in Belgium, Holland, and France, for example, work until their mid-60s. There is, however, also a political reason for the growth of European welfare states. Once welfare programs expanded after 1945, European politicians began promising to increase spending on things like pensions, to lower retirement ages, and to provide health care for free. Why? Because it was an easy way to attract votes. And how did governments pay for this expansion of welfare programs? Well, they raised taxes. But raising taxes did not cover the costs. So they borrowed money. But European politicians, I have to say, are not the only ones responsible for this situation. Also responsible are those ordinary European citizens who voted to encourage politicians in Europe to expand the welfare state almost to the point of bankrupting their own countries. Now, it's very unpolitically correct to say this, but I'm going to. But one reality of democratic systems is that if enough people want expansive welfare programs, it's really hard for politicians to resist these demands. Why? Because they risk rejection by the voters or, as we have seen, mobs and riots in the streets of Athens. Now, the bankruptcy of nations is not, however, the only result of pairing democracy with large welfare states. The high taxes and the debt which pay for big welfare states are also weakening Europe's ability to create the wealth that pays for welfare programs. And this brings me to the fourth characteristic of Europe's economic problems, which is declining productivity. However we look at the statistics, the message is very clear. Economic growth in Europe has been declining since the 1960s. In the 1970s, the average growth rate in Western European countries was 3.4%. It was 2.4% in the 1980s. It was 2.2% in the 1990s. Since 2001, it has only averaged 1%. A similar slowdown in economic growth has not occurred anywhere else in the world. So you might ask, why have Europeans become less and less productive? Well, again, there are many causes, but here are some of the most prominent. If you want large welfare states, you have to have high taxes. But even many left-wing economists will tell you that high taxes reduce the incentive for people to be entrepreneurial and create wealth, or to work harder and more hours, and thereby earn more money. This is one reason why Europeans are generally less entrepreneurial and work less hours than Americans and Chinese. Another cause of low productivity is the fact that European governments employ armies. This is the only way to describe it. Armies of civil servants. Now, civil servants do some things, but civil servants are also very, very expensive. Making the situation worse in Europe is that it is actually very difficult to reduce the number of civil servants. In Greece, for example, it was until recently actually against the law to dismiss a civil servant on grounds of incompetence. Now, that's just one reason why, despite the huge level of Greek government debt, it took more than 2 years after 2009, when the Greek debt crisis began, it took more than 2 years for the Greek government to dismiss a single Greek civil servant. And despite employing more than 850,000 public servants, this is a nation of 11 million people, so you do the math. Despite employing more than 850,000 public servants, the Greek government in 2011 promised to reduce its public sector workforce by a mere 30,000 people. In other words, about 3%. And of these people, the Greek government only actually dismissed 1,000, while putting another 9,000 on paid leave and leaving the remaining 20,000 in their jobs. So that works out to about a 0.1% decrease in the number of civil servants in Greece. I call that masterly inactivity. Now, this issue of civil servants brings me to the fifth major European economic problem, which of course is unemployment. Now, there are some European countries, such as Germany, which have relatively low unemployment. But for 25 years, European countries have had the highest unemployment rates in the developed world. Belgium, the heart of the EU, has endured unemployment of 13% since 2002. At present, Spain's unemployment rate is 23%. Yes, 23%. And for people below the age of 30, it is an incredible 41%. So, why is there such high unemployment in Europe? Well, one reason is that European employers are very reluctant to hire people. Why? Because once you give someone a full-time job in most European countries, it is very, very, very hard to dismiss them. As a result, European employers hire many people on a part-time basis. This means that many Europeans, especially young Europeans, earn their income through a series of part-time jobs. And this, I think, as many of you know, is often very demoralizing for young people. Now, this subject of young people brings me to the last economic factor that I want to identify as contributing to Europe's economic problems. It's simply this. The number of young people in Europe is falling, the number of older people is increasing, and the overall population of Europe is shrinking. The population replacement level for a country, what keeps the population size stable, is a fertility rate of 2.1 children per woman. Now, according to the United Nations, the average fertility rate of European women in 2010 was 1.5. The figures for Greece, 1.4, Spain, 1.4, Portugal, 1.3, Italy, 1.3, and Germany, 1.3, are especially depressing. Ireland alone reached 2001. So these figures, what do they mean? Well, they mean that over the next 20 years, the number of Europeans aged over 65 is going to increase by 40%, while the number of young people continues to shrink. Now, these demographic realities pose enormous long-term problems for Europe. generally it would lead to 1, declining productivity, 2, a growing burden on already bankrupt welfare states, and 3, fewer and fewer workers supporting more and more retirees. If nothing changes, then by 2040, every 2 workers will be supporting 1 retiree in Europe. Now, any economist will tell you that is simply not economically sustainable. So, huge debt, a flawed currency, unsustainable welfare states, falling productivity, high unemployment, and immense demographic challenges. All are signs, I think, of a Europe in deep economic trouble. But it also creates a dangerous combination when you think about it. Because when low economic growth and demographic decline are combined with welfare states in Europe, in other words, early retirement, generous pensions, free healthcare, armies of civil servants, legislation that emphasizes job security, something eventually has to give. Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy have reached that point. And I think the rest of Europe is struggling to avoid following these countries into the abyss. Now, by now, I suspect some of you may have noticed something. At no point have I blamed business, banks, or even greed for Europe's economic problems. Why? Well, as it happens, I think that greed within the financial industry and among business leaders did have a role in creating some of Europe's difficulties. One reason, for example, that Germany is so worried about Greece is that private German banks will be among the most affected if Greece eventually defaults and declares bankruptcy. There's also no doubt, I think, in my mind, that many European banks behaved irresponsibly because they assumed correctly that governments would rescue them. They assumed that governments would rescue private banks if private banks risked going bankrupt. If I might put it this way, banks were very happy to privatize their profits, but also very anxious to socialize their losses. But moral failure, I think, also had a role among other actors responsible for Europe's economic crisis. Moral failure, for example, embraces politicians who used welfare programs to create groups of people who will regularly vote for them. It includes trade union leaders who refuse to accept that Europe's heavy labor market regulation actually damages the long-term interest of employees. And frankly, it also reflects failure, moral failure, by many ordinary Europeans, those who live for the here and now, those who have incurred enormous levels of personal debt, and those who seem very happy for their children, assuming they even bother to have children, to pay the economic price for their irresponsibility. So if we're going to talk about moral failure and Europe's present economic crisis, then yes, greed certainly had a role, but it had a role in every segment of European society. But I also think that identifying greed as the primary moral element contributing to Europe's economic crisis is a little too simple. It's a little too easy. And that brings me to the second part of my remarks, which is the cultural factors contributing to Europe's economic crisis. Now, I think that the word culture is one of those heavily overused words. But in sociological terms, culture is a way of describing the approach to life, the values, the understanding of law, the sciences and arts, and ultimately the religious beliefs prevailing in a given society. Now, all these things have implications for economic life in any society. But in Europe's case, I think there are 3 cultural factors that have helped shape Europe's current crisis. The first cultural factor concerns the value that most Europeans believe should be given priority in economic life. If you ask Europeans what they value more in economic life, freedom or security, then opinion poll after opinion poll after opinion poll in virtually every European country shows that most Europeans value security. Security, 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 security. In response to the same question, most Americans, and interestingly, even more Chinese, say that they value liberty more than security. Now, I think the reasons for this European attachment to security are quite easy to understand. I think, for example, if Americans had experienced all the horrors of 20th century European history, in other words, 2 savage world wars, Marxism, fascism, the Gulag, the Holocaust, I suspect we might share this European desire for security. But unfortunately for Europeans, this longing for security at virtually any price is contributing to many of Europe's economic problems. It helps to explain, for example, why so many Europeans are so attached to large welfare states and so opposed to any meaningful welfare reforms. I think the same desire for security also explains the thousands of young men and women who protested on the streets of cities like Lisbon, Madrid, and Athens throughout 2011. Called the indignant ones, or les indignés, these young people were very loud in their criticisms of Europe's politicians and in expressing their own worries about their future. Now, I think we all know that it's quite normal, maybe even good, for young people to be idealistic and attracted to proposals for radical change. But studies of the views of these young Europeans have revealed that les indignés did not want radical change. No, instead they wanted exactly what their parents have enjoyed. They wanted jobs from which they cannot be dismissed. They wanted free health care. They wanted government-guaranteed minimal incomes. They wanted 6 weeks annual vacation. They wanted to retire at the age of 55, and they wanted generous state pensions. In other words, les indignés were not revolutionaries. No, they're what I call status quo-narians. They want to maintain the present European status quo. They don't, for example, want labour market reform. In fact, they protested against labour market reforms. Like their parents, their economic priority is security, 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 preferably provided by the state. Now, the second cultural factor, I think, which contributes to Europe's economic problems today is the way that many Europeans understand the value of solidarity. Now, solidarity, of course, is simply a modern way of expressing the Christian belief that we should all love our neighbour, that all of us must go beyond the logic of the market to care for our neighbour, especially our brothers and sisters in need. There are, however, good ways and bad ways of realizing solidarity. And in Europe, unfortunately, the duty to take care of those in need is not seen as a primary responsibility of individuals, of the family, of civil society, or even of the church. No. Surveys of Europeans make it clear that most Europeans believe solidarity is realized through direct state action. Many Europeans have thus reduced their responsibilities to the poor, to the weak, to the disabled, to the forgotten, to paying the taxes that support welfare programs or voting for politicians who vote to expand the welfare state or grow the amount of labour market regulation. If you want proof of this, consider the extremely low levels of charitable giving in most European countries, or the very low numbers of genuinely free, independent associations addressing social problems in Europe. Now, I happen to think that the state does have some responsibility to help realize the value of solidarity. But I think it was John Paul II in his second social encyclical Sollicitude Re Socialis who pointed out that solidarity is primarily a virtue. And virtues are not about regulations or bureaucracies. Virtues are about habits of action that are part of the path towards holiness. The third cultural factor that I believe has significantly contributed to Europe's current problems is what I like to call a crisis of truth. Because from its very beginning, Europe's economic crisis has been characterized by a disturbing pattern of lies, self-deception, and a failure to keep promises. Let me give you some concrete examples of the economic effects of failure to live in truth. When the euro was created, those governments that wanted to enter the eurozone had to show that they had kept government debt and spending within certain limits. They also had to promise to keep debt and public spending within the certain limits after they entered the euro. Now, these promises were designed to stop governments in Europe from engaging in precisely the type of spending that's helped contribute to the current crisis. Now, unfortunately, many governments that wanted to enter the single currency effectively cheated their way into the euro. The Portuguese government, for example, used accounting tricks. It transferred amounts of its budget into organizations that, while technically independent, were still controlled by the government. Greece just lied about its finances. In 2004, the Greek finance minister admitted publicly that Greece had falsified its statistics in order to gain entry into the euro. But even worse is the fact that most countries that entered the euro almost immediately broke their promises to keep spending within certain limits. As early as 2005, 7 euro countries had broken the rules about spending, including France and Germany. And what was the response of the European Union? Well, it did what the European Union always does. It created numerous exemptions to the rules that made the rules meaningless. 5 years later, we see the consequences with the huge levels of government debt that are now the norm in many European countries. But also at work here, I think, is another moral factor that Pope Benedict XVI mentioned in his 2010 book, Light of the World. Speaking about this pattern of lies, of untruth, and of failure to keep promises in order to live off large levels of debt, Benedict stated that it showed how Europeans were, quote, living at the expense of future generations, end quote. Now, in a recent speech to France's Roman Catholic bishops, the Archbishop of Paris, Cardinal André Ventoux, made a similar point, quote, we risk, he said, continuing to believe we can continue to live indefinitely on credit. And in accumulating such high debt, we consume the opportunities for younger generations and place an intolerable burden on their shoulders, end quote. In other words, someone has to pay for all this debt. And many Western Europeans seem very happy for their children to pick up the bill. And I think there's something deeply immoral about that. But Benedict, he then sharpens the argument. He says that this willingness on the part of governments, communities, and individuals to live off debt means that people are, quote, living in untruth. We live, Benedict said, on the basis of appearances. And the huge debts are meanwhile treated as something that we are simply entitled to. End quote. I would go further and say that such attitudes reflect a mindset of practical atheism, living and acting as if God does not exist, as if this life is the only life, and as if the future does not matter. Only people who have no hope in God, no hope in redemption, no hope for the future, will think and act in this way. I think it was the economist John Maynard Keynes who once famously said, "In the long run, we are all dead." Well, if we choose to live our lives according to that perspective, then living off debt is entirely rational. But in the long run, I think we can say pretty accurately, such attitudes also destroy entire civilizations. Now, I just mentioned the habit of living like a practical atheist. Aristotle actually described this as the worst of the three classic forms of atheism. And this brings me to the final part of my remarks, which is to ask, what can Christians and the church in Europe do? How can the church help Europe address its current economic and cultural challenges? Well, I think there are many things the church can do, and there are many things the church should not do. But I want to make the following three suggestions. First, I do not think that the church's pastors should involve themselves in diagnosing the strictly economic causes of Europe's crisis. Nor, I believe, should they be promoting specific economic solutions. Of course, the church, in fact all Christians, have a special responsibility to defend the poor and the weak, especially during times of crisis. But the church, speaking as the church, does not offer technical solutions to economic problems. It's not its field of competence. Instead, I would suggest the church's special competence in addressing Europe's economic crisis lies in two areas. The first of these is morality, and the second of these is culture. In a recent Christmas address, Pope Benedict said this. He said, "Europe is undergoing an economic and financial crisis which is ultimately based on the ethical crisis looming over the old continent." End quote. Now, as I hope I've demonstrated, greed, self-deception, and lies by European politicians, businessmen, trade union leaders, civil servants, and ordinary citizens all played a role. So for this reason, I think the church should not hesitate to remind European Christians and European non-believers that moral failure doesn't just cut us off from God's love. Failure to love our neighbor also has real-life consequences in this world, including in the economy. At a deeper level, however, I'd argue that Europe's economic crisis has exposed significant cultural problems, even moral and spiritual emptiness, in many European societies. Now, here again, I think the church, if it chose the right forums and found the right tone, could help Europeans to ask themselves questions, such as, why are so many Europeans so anxious about security that they are apparently willing to bankrupt their governments? Why do so many Europeans reduce the virtue of solidarity to state welfare programs? Why do so many Europeans apparently not care about high levels of debt? And why are so many Europeans just not having children? Now, I think these are questions that many Europeans are generally very reluctant to consider. Whenever I ask these questions, the subject normally changes. And I think one reason for this reluctance is that once we begin thinking about these questions, we soon realize that they have a religious dimension. As perhaps the greatest, I think, of 20th century Catholic theologians, Henri de Lubac once wrote, quote, "As long as contemporary humanism derives its logic from atheistic foundations, human beings can only organize the world against themselves." So I'd argue that the cultural pathologies of contemporary Europe reflect what happens to a society in which the cult at the heart of a culture changes from Christianity to secularism. Let me explain. European culture was once characterized by an understanding of integral human flourishing, in which freedom was understood as integrated with truth, and in which the hope of eternal life was real. But does anyone really doubt now that much of contemporary European culture is now characterized by all the dehumanizing assumptions of secularism? Because for many Europeans, wisdom has been reduced to utilitarianism. Freedom is understood as license. Humans are viewed as purely material creatures. Reason is limited to the physical sciences. And as for God, well, he is either considered not to exist, or he's reduced to someone who, as Benedict once wrote, quote, "demands nothing, never scolds, who accepts everyone and everything, who no longer does anything but affirm us," end quote. Christ as teddy bear. Now, European Christians have not, of course, proved immune to these cultural changes. To say that the choices and attitudes of many European Christians are essentially the same as those of secularist Christians is not to be judgmental. It's simply to speak the truth. Within the church, we often talk about how changes in Western society since the 1960s have negatively affected the Christian church. Fewer people, however, consider how the decline of Christian faith as a reality in the lives of many European Christians has negatively affected European society. It's allowed Christian faith to be replaced by practical atheism, authentic morality to be corrupted by consequentialism, and our horizons to shrink to an overwhelming concern for self-preservation. As the German philosopher Robert Spemann once wrote, quote, "Europe's denial of God has left Europeans in the banal nihilism of the entertainment society and awareness of what it actually means to say that God does not exist," end quote. And this is the thought with which I'd like to conclude. That if it is true that some of Europe's economic difficulties reflect deeper cultural dilemmas, which in turn reflect deeper religious challenges, then perhaps the most important thing that the church can do is to show Europeans how to live the virtue of solidarity in their everyday lives, instead of simply delegating it to state bureaucrats. To help Europeans see that embracing life in its fullness means taking risks, instead of imagining that the state can protect us from everything. To demonstrate to Europeans that to have children is not a burden, but to affirm the wonder of human life. To show European non-believers that when we act, as Pascal said, volutice Deus dorator, which means as if God does exist, then we become more responsible people. And above all, it involves showing Europeans that integral human flourishing, the truly good life, is not realized through using credit to live beyond our means, but rather in the fullness of the truth that's revealed to us in Jesus the Christ. Now, of course, none of these things require European Christians to march in the street, to occupy stock exchanges, or even promote one set of economic policies over another. In fact, they demand something far more challenging. which is to live the Christian faith with joy and without compromise in their daily lives in contemporary secularist Europe. Social commitment, political action, and economics are important. In fact, if Europe is going to escape its economic problems, it needs better politics, more civil commitment, and the right economic policies. But in the final analysis, Europe also needs Christ and his church, the church which gave Europe its identity. But that can only happen, I think, if the Christian church in Europe is true to herself and resists accommodation to the world. To put it another way, the church must live its interior life much more intensely if the church is going to have a transforming effect upon the rest of the world. As Pope Benedict reminded German Christians during his 2011 visit to his homeland, quote, "In the history of the church, we see how she adapts herself to the standards of the world. To accomplish her true task, the church must constantly detach herself from her tendency towards worldliness and once again become open towards God. It is not a question of ignoring anything about the truth of our present situation. Rather, it is a question of living the faith fully here and now in the utterly sober light of day. This does not mean withdrawing from the world. On the contrary, it means a church detached from worldliness and bearing witness to the primacy of God's love through word and deed, here and now. As the church, let us live the simplicity of a great love, which is both the simplest and hardest thing on earth, because it demands no more and no less than the gift of oneself. A more challenging, a more radical, and a more necessary message to a church in Europe that is racked in economic, cultural, and ultimately religious crisis is very difficult to imagine. Thank you. I believe we have now some time for questions. So,
well, a moving train can't be stopped on a dime. Can we elaborate a little bit on how you feel that the solution that you propose can maybe turn it around more quickly than I would suppose that it might take quite a lot of time for you to have the cultural changes that you're suggesting?
Sure. Well, there are obviously some things that, at least on the level of economic policy, that European governments can do, and some are doing. In fact, one of the reasons that Germany is doing so well right now, we forget that the German economy is doing very well right now, is because in the 2000s they were willing to put themselves through some very difficult economic reforms, opening up the economy, making it easier for employers to fire people, reducing levels of subsidies, etc., etc. And of course, the government that put most of those changes through was voted out of office, which is not normally a great incentive for governments to be reformers. But they did the right thing. Sweden is doing very well, paradoxically enough, right now, because it too in the 1990s and 2000s introduced the same type of liberalizing reforms that one would hope much of the rest of Europe would embrace. Now, I don't want to overestimate this. It's still the case that 59% of the economy in Sweden is controlled by the government. But that's progress considering it was about 75% 20 years ago. So there are economic changes that can happen, but that's not an economic problem. That's a political problem. And the problem that many European politicians face is that they know that if they move in the direction of favoring reforms and actually implementing reforms, they get voted out of office. So while economic change is important and one has to hope that there'll be enough of a tipping point in European societies that more voters will be prepared to accept the need for radical changes on the economic level, I don't put my trust in the long term in economic policy and politics, because if the culture doesn't change, in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, they're going to be encountering the same problems over and over and over again. Now, I know cultural change is slow, but on the other hand, it's also the most effective way of changing a society. So while I think there are some things that can be done in the short term, if the fundamental cultural settings don't change, Europe is going to simply become more and more irrelevant economically and politically in the global economy. And I think they know that. Enough of them know that. But whether they're willing to do anything about it, because remember, a lot of them won't be alive when some of the real problems start happening, is a different question, which raises the issue of that's why you actually need to be concerned about the future. If you don't care about the future and you're a contemporary European, then everything's fine. You die, that's it. You've enjoyed life. What is there? Who cares? That's part. If you don't change that mentality, the politics and the economic settings will not change over the long term.
I think that great job, by the way, very close, very educational. It's really enjoyed it. But the thing that concerns me, and I wonder if you share my concern, is almost all your comments. You see Europe driving a car over the cliff. They're looking in the mirror, and they're seeing us breathing right down their neck. And they don't have a military that's going to give them the air. You share that?
Sure. In fact, I have a book coming out in November. It's called Becoming Europe, Economic Decline, Culture, and America's Future. And what this book does is basically go through, it's done. It's done now. But what it does is it goes through and looks at some of these economic and cultural indicators and says, okay, well, this is how Europe has ended up in its current position. Here's a comparison with how America is doing in some of these areas. And what you find is that there are some areas where the United States is frighteningly close to Europe when it comes to some of these trends. But on the other hand, there are also areas in which the American economic culture is still quite distinctive from that of Europe. Perhaps the biggest point of distinction is entrepreneurship. America remains one of the most entrepreneurial nations in the world, despite the fact that we have higher corporate taxes than in Europe, despite the fact that it's getting harder and harder for entrepreneurs to find areas of the economy that are not so heavily regulated that the incentive to actually create something is very small. So there are areas, I think, like that where we can see there's a lot of hope. There's also the case, I think, one of the differences between America and Europe in this regard is that there are lots of Americans who are very unhappy about increasing welfare dependency, increasing regulation, and they're also willing to vote in ways that express their displeasure with that. At the same time, Americans are a little torn about some of these issues as well, because if you look at much opinion poll survey data, what you find is that if you ask Americans, do we need to reduce the size of debt and the size of the welfare state? Yes, 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 yes. But do we need to get rid of this particular program in this district? Oh, no, no. Even Tea Party people, by a ratio of 2 to 1, are opposed to reducing Social Security payments. Tea Party people. So what does that tell you about the rest of the country? So the situation in America, I think, is in many respects different. We have many more reasons to be optimistic, but there are also some very negative signs of what I call economic Europeanization, which are starting to manifest themselves here. And it shows up in efforts like to try and reform different parts of economic policy. The resistance comes from groups who have a stake in maintaining the status quo, and they're not going to go away. So it's a political problem again. Yes?
You mentioned the church a lot and its role, and we've known, at least here in America, we've seen a moral and a theological sickness and deadness in the church in Europe. Part of it is, in connection to the church, even state church, just how that's been hand in glove with the state. You've talked about this almost in some senses, what can we do to stop it, but could there be, on the flip side, could this actually be a blessing to let Europe go over the cliff, a blessing for the church even too, because culture does shape the church, and whether we like to say the church shapes the culture does dramatically shape the church. And so if the culture goes to pot, will that help to shape the church? and shake it up so that you sort of get rid of the deadness, and so that they can recommit themselves again to the core core issues of the church. I mean, could this be actually a blessing in disguise for the church and for Europe?
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it, because I think you're right that if you go to many European countries, you find this spiritual deadness. And it doesn't matter whether it's Roman Catholics or Protestants or Orthodox, the spiritual deadness is everywhere. And the state church thing is an important factor in that, although, you know, even in countries where there are not state churches, you still find low levels of religious participation and things like that. But on the other hand, what you do find is that to be a believing Christian in Europe today, you have to really believe this stuff, right? When I meet, for example, young seminarians in Europe who are training to be priests or pastors, they're not in it because there's social status involved in becoming a minister or a priest. They're not in it because it's to please their mother or something like that. No, they're in it because they actually believe in the truth of the Christian faith. And that also replicates, this attitude replicates itself, I think, with most regular practicing Christians in Europe today. They really do believe, because there's no other reason why they'd be there, right? Because the cultural settings are such that religion is viewed as a little weird. There's no social incentive anymore to go into the priesthood or to the into the ministry, any of these things. So in one sense, what one is finding is that many churches in Europe are essentially either opting to continue to embrace a type of accommodationist mentality, and those churches are dead. Just as they're dying in the United States. Churches that embrace the accommodation to secular culture, that we must follow the history wherever it's going, they all die because they're stripped of Christian faith and Christian truth. Those churches that are finding creative ways to engage the culture in ways that don't betray what they actually believe are the ones that are doing relatively well. So, for example, people don't realize that in Italy, for example, since 1980, the rate of participation among Catholics has actually increased. If you go through a number of European settings, you'll find that there are actually some significant signs of hope, which we miss in the wealth of negative information that we receive. Now, do I think that it would be good for Europe to go over the cliff? No, I don't. One, because the economic consequences are not good for everyone. But secondly, cultures take a long time to change and to revive. And I think it's better for the church to act as what Benedict calls a creative minority, to be in the public square, to be in the modern world, but not compromising about one believes, and persuading others as to the rightness of one's position and where their positions are not so correct. That's harder and it's difficult, but it's not as if the church has not been in this situation before. Think about the church immediately after the French Revolution. Everything was a disaster. Think about the church when the Roman Empire collapsed. Immense cultural challenges that the church in Europe has overcome. The problem today, I think, is that the struggle is, what one is struggling against is far more amorphous. It's not as if Europe is filled with militant atheists who are going around burning churches and killing ministers and priests. No, what you encounter more is this sort of what I call practical atheism. People just living and acting as if God doesn't exist, as if this has no consequences for my life, that your view is just the same as any other's view, etc., etc. And this problem of historical denial, this willingness of so many Europeans to pretend that Europe between, let's say, the AD 33 and 1950 didn't exist. Many of you remember when the Europeans tried to put together a constitutional treaty, they had this preamble that talked about the origins of Europe lying in the Greeks and the Romans and the Enlightenment. Apparently 1,500 years of Christianity just disappeared. But that's an example of what European Christians are having to deal with now. It's not so much a sort of formal frontal assault that one experienced with, say, Marxism or fascism. It's much more amorphous in that respect, harder to deal with. Not impossible, but harder. Judge.
Dr. Gregg, I understand you to be saying that if democracies are going to be saved from themselves, people have to be better, more unselfish, more Christian, more forward-looking. In other words, better. If that is not possible, if the founders had too much faith in fallen human nature, then is democracy really a failed experiment?
Well,
Listening to your words brought that question to my mind.
well, I think the most profound commentator on the United States was a Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville when he wrote his book Democracy in America. The first volume is quite optimistic. Second volume is written a couple of years later, and he's much more skeptical about certain things, including certain things to do with democracy. And he says, look, societies are heading in this general democratic direction, that you can't go back to absolute monarchy. We're not going to go back to situations of aristocratic oligarchy. We're not going back to those things. We're all heading towards some form of democracy. And the question is, for him was, that's inevitable, but we have to think about what are the appropriate cultural roots in which that democracy has to be grounded. And in America, he said that one of the things that he gave him optimism about democracy in America was the fact that religion was so prominent and so active and so much a part of everyday American life, in often quite understated ways, but it was just there. And he said this was important because it checked some of the instincts that go along with democracy, like the tendency to think, well, if we just get enough people to vote for this person, he'll use the state to give us what we want. A Christian doesn't think that way. That was de Tocqueville's point. And he was very worried about Europe because he said if religion is weakening there, then the capacity of democracy to resist some of these, well, I guess there's no other way to describe them, but corrupt tendencies is very hard to deal with. So that's all of a long way of saying that I think you're right, that unless you ground democracy in certain values and certain ways of living, it's not going to work. And so when I hear people talk about, well, we need political reform, et cetera, I'm sure. But if the culture is not in the right settings, then democracy can become deeply dysfunctional. And you see this in Europe today, where the cultural settings are shifted towards security at any price, the state must give me what I want, that's its responsibility, and that I don't actually owe anything to my neighbor except for the fact that I vote for parties that agree to redistribute more wealth. So yeah, I think that's right. And that comes back again to the church as the primary former of culture. Cult is the heart of culture. When the religion of a society changes, and by religion I just don't mean, say, Christianity or Islam or Judaism, I mean the way people think about God and the way that that has implications for how they live their lives. Once that goes through a decisive change, the entire society goes along with it. So that, I think, is the bigger challenge for America and Europe right now. Ma'am.
I'm just wondering, how does Czech Republic fit into this idea then, being that they're 99% atheist?
They have a long history, actually, of disenchantment with Christianity. It really goes back to the 17th century. Christianity is very much associated with the rule of the Habsburg Empire. And in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, the political leaders of the country were what you might call continental liberal atheists and agnostics for the most part. And you have, it was also a very religiously divided country as well. And you're right, it is in fact one of the countries with the biggest proportion of people who describe themselves as atheists or agnostics. But that being said, those people who are believers are quite firm and strong in their faith. They're very active in society. And Christianity in the Czech Republic is not treated with the disdain that it is in a number of other Western European countries. Even agnostics and atheists acknowledge the role played by the church during the communist period in resisting what was obviously a totalitarian system. So in the Czech Republic, what you find, you don't find hostility. You don't even find indifference. And sometimes I think indifference is worse than hostility. What you find is a sort of live and let live attitude, which I think is offers far more prospects for evangelization and far more prospects for Christians assuming a full place in the public square than you find in a number of other European societies. Other comments? Yes.
Express some of your thoughts on media, because we have
On the
media
oh.
and kind of the way, I mean, I hear things about the American media and their influence sort of spreading across the world and not welcome. And I feel that, you know, we have 4 young adults in our family, and I feel like they're pretty exceptional. They've been raised to be some pretty bright kids, but I have a difficult time because the media is bombarding them, and they're so heavily marketed, and trying to keep their minds toward the truth, and not, you know, I don't know. It's like the truth is overwhelmed by marketing, and it's kind of a battle.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's several things I'll say. First of all, the media in Europe is far worse than in America. What you find, but let me just say a couple of things. First of all, as a profession, journalists have one of the lowest rates of religious belief of all professions. If you look at most survey material, that comes out pretty quickly. The second thing you find is that an archbishop said to me once that a lot of people who work in the media are not particularly well educated. I mean, we think of them as being learned and very gifted with speaking, etc., etc. But at least in my experience, and I think in the experience of a lot of other people, it's really hard to explain things to them because they don't even have a starting point for even beginning the discussion. Particularly when it comes to about religion, what you find is they either know close to nothing or are implicitly hostile to any form of religious belief. So you're dealing with, it's a very hard case. It's a very hard case. What do we do about it? Well, I think the Christian church does what it has always should do what it has always done, which is continue to evangelize the culture, to find ways of using creative new media to do that for ourselves, to find and use new forms of media that are very good at just getting over the message and getting through the chatter that you find with a lot of the contemporary media so that you can reach people directly. That's one of the great things about the internet. It cuts out so many of the intermediaries. One of the things you find in Europe, for example, is a lot of churches have set up their own television stations, they've set up their own websites, which people can watch for themselves. They can hear what the church says about any number of issues without some interpretive lens, a very secularist interpretive lens, being applied to everything that you hear. So I think it's one thing to acknowledge clearly there is a problem with the way that the media talks about and understands religion, but my basic view is you go around them. You engage them as far as you can, and there's limits to that. I can tell you from personal experience there's a lot of limits to that. And sometimes it's not because of their bad will. Sometimes it's they just have no idea about the subject. But I think that going around those barriers and talking to people directly using new forms of media is, in my view, one of the best ways to deal with this particular problem. And of course, if you form your children properly in the faith, if you inform them in objective morality, the truth about good and evil, if that takes root, it takes a lot of things to take that out of people. I mean, we think about the media as being incredibly influential, and they are to a certain extent, but I also think that if one has a sound formation in the faith and in our capacity to use reason to know truth, we will soon discern very quickly when we're hearing lies and when we're hearing half-truths. And I think we're out of time. We're out of time. I'm sorry. Thank you.